Okay, hopefully we have sound. For some reason, my headphone things stopped working, so I have a backup microphone here. Let's hope this works. It's the third, fourth time I've been trying to record this lecture, so hopefully it's good to go. Um, but for this week, we'll be talking about criminal profiling, and then that'll lead us into a discussion about serial homicide. So when we talk about criminal profiling, it goes by several different names. Um, One of these is behavioral profiling. It's also known as psychological profiling or investigative profiling. But we'll begin this lecture off with just a brief history of how it came about as a field, let's say, and kind of what's involved in um, psychological or criminal profiling nowadays, and some of the issues that come along with it. Um, but we'll also take a look at what actually goes into a profile. But how it started was that basically some police departments in the 1940s were reaching out to mental health professionals um, about particularly difficult cases. So cold cases, cases where they didn't really have much of the lead, or where there were so many suspects or potential suspects that they were having a very difficult time narrowing it down in terms of who that they should be actually focusing on. So they turned to these mental health professionals who created these psychological profiles. The only problem was that some of these early profiles were kind of too psychological in nature, meaning that they weren't actually all that helpful, because when we talk about a psychological profile, we're talking about what exists inside somebody's head, right? What exists inside their mind. So it's not really giving us an idea of who we should be looking for in terms of, say, things like sociodemographic characteristics like race or employment, or even it's not giving us a whole lot of information about what kind of behaviors we should be looking for in terms of our suspect. So these earlier profiles were actually not all that useful. It wasn't until the 1950s when we had the Mad Bomber in New York City, when the NYPD actually reached out to a psychiatrist named James Russell to evaluate the case of a serial bomber. So somebody who was blown up a whole bunch of different sites, and he kind of was able to evade the police for 16 years. So the NYPD was at its wit's end. They reached out to the psychiatrist, James Russell, to help evaluate the case. So the New York City Police Department gave Dr. Russell access to the complete case file. So everything that was involved in the file. That included photos of the crime scene, letters from the bomber. The bomber actually sent letters to press and to the police department itself as ways to kind of taunt the police. This is something we'll see also when we get to serial homicide, okay, that these types of criminals tend to do quite frequently. It's try to get caught, or it's kind of like a game. They get pleasure out of eluding the police. Part of them actually wants to get caught. But also, Dr. Russell was given descriptions of the type of bombs that were used, the components that were used to make up the bombs, where they were placed, when they were placed, so on and so forth. So basically, what came of this was after viewing the case file, Dr. Russell was able to conclude that the bomber was of Eastern European descent, that he was over the age of 40, lived with a relative, that he was polite, soft-spoken, attended church regularly, and was exceptionally neat in appearance. So we almost have a kind of description, right, of who we might want to be looking for at this point. We have some socioeconomic information, including age and ethnicity. We have some behavioral components in here, including their attendance at church, their appearance, being neat in their appearance. Also some psychological stuff in there in terms of being polite, soft-spoken, and suffering from paranoia. So this was a more useful profile than, say, some of those earlier attempts to psychologically profile potential criminals. This one was much more useful. Actually gave people something to kind of look out for. And the NYPD actually ran this description in the New York Times on Christmas Day, 1956. It says, "Look for a heavy man, middle-aged, foreign-born, Roman Catholic, single, lives with a brother or sister. When you find him, chances are he will be wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned." And believe it or not, when he was caught, he was in fact wearing a double-breasted suit, buttoned, and it was Eastern European. This profile kind of matched to a T. And we have a little video that I'll show that kind of describes the Mad Bomber and how this case brought about the beginnings of profiling as we know it today, right? So when we take a look at this type of profile, it's a number of things that are going on in there. It's not just psychological. We're not just talking about, well, this person might have suffered from some childhood abuse or something. There's actual concrete things in that profile that we can look for, that we can actually be on the lookout for. So Brussels described his profile as the result of, quote unquote, working backwards from standard inductive practices, so inductive reasoning that are used by mental health providers to predict patients' behaviors. So as soon as we have an idea of a person's diagnoses or their types of personalities, what kind of behaviors they might be more inclined to engage in, we kind of work backwards in terms of trying to understand, well, what kind of person would engage in such behaviors, and not just such behaviors, but also things in terms of the details of the behaviors. When did they happen? Who was actually targeted? How was the crime scene left? Was it staged or was it left as is? What kind of methods were used to commit crimes? So in this case, just understanding the intricacies, how well those bombs were actually made. Were they sophisticated? Did they reflect some high level of meticulousness, or were they kind of sloppy? Also, did they reflect some level of skill that somebody might have gotten from the military, or so on and so forth, right? So by taking a look at these particular aspects of a crime, you're able to kind of induce what kind of person and what kind of traits would lead somebody to engage in these behaviors or engage in these crimes, but also in the way that they have done it. So you might have different profiles, of course, for different bombers. You might have two people, leaving bombs around New York, but based on the time of day that they do it, the targets, who they're actually bombing, how their bombs are built, the level of sophistication involved, how they left the crime scene, so on and so forth. All of those things might actually produce very different types of profiles in them. Well, regardless, Russell's work caught the attention of the FBI and its behavioral science unit. And the FBI has been leading the way in criminal profiling ever since. So if you want to be a criminal profiler, good luck. There's not a whole lot of those positions that exist, but you might get, really lucky, and it's not as sexy of a job as it looks like on TV. It's a lot of paperwork and lots of reading through files. So even something like Silence of the Lambs was one of the all-time great horror movies, but also that got a whole lot of people interested in criminal profiling. It's really not that exciting. You're not likely to visit Dr. Lecter anytime soon for his advice. You're just going to be pouring through boxes and boxes of papers, coming up with some type of profile. And as new information comes in, you'll be constantly readjusting your profile. So the FBI has been leading the way ever since, and we have a video here that kind of describes the Mad Bomber crime spree in more detail, and how it led to the development of criminal profiling. So we'll watch this because they'll do a much better job explaining it than I have. Okay?
From 1940 to 1957, a man known as the Mad Bomber terrorized New York City. He set off 32 bombs in public places, often in movie theaters. For years, the New York City Police Department couldn't solve the case, so they asked a psychiatrist to assemble a psychological profile of the unknown bomber.
The first offender profile was by James Bressel in the Mad Bomber case. If there were others before him, no one who's looked has been able to find it yet.
Dr. Bressel's revolutionary tool helped the FBI create a new method, criminal profiling, that changed American criminology forever.
The first bomb was in a Con Edison plant on the far west side. A Con Ed worker found a bomb in a wooden box on a windowsill on his lunch hour. And in that box was a note, Con Ed crooks, this is for you.
The notes kept coming. The bomber sent threatening letters to the police, newspapers, and to Con Edison, each signed with the initials FP. Then, 11 years after the first bomb was found, another exploded in Grand Central Terminal. Moments later, a phone rang in the Grand Central Oyster Bar. Was there much damage? A man asked. His voice had a slight foreign accent. After the Grand Central explosion, more bombs went off in quick succession.
He would sit in the orchestra. When the lights came down, he would take out a cheap penknife, and he would rip open the upholstery of an adjacent seat and place his homemade bomb into the upholstery. There is one, supposedly, in the Empire State Building that has never been found. At its worst, it was similar to 9/11. People were scared to ride the subways, scared to go into department stores. It was as if his madness was contagious. In one case, a woman turned her husband into the police.
Over 16 years, more than 30 bombs had either exploded or been discovered undetonated, and the NYPD was no closer to finding the culprit.
The police were essentially conducting their work as they had 100 years earlier, roughing up suspects, leaning on informants, and beating the bushes.
In many ways, the approach to physical evidence was pre-scientific. This was pre-DNA, pre-trace fiber analysis. Most of the people working in crime labs were former police officers. They weren't scientists.
As the investigation dragged on, one team bore the brunt of the dangerous work, the New York City Bomb Squad. 10 detectives, led by Captain Howard Finney, patrolled the city's public spaces and defused live bombs. With the police's current methods failing, Finney decided to look for an alternative strategy.
In desperation, the head of the bomb squad decided to show all of the evidence to a psychiatrist in hopes that he might be able to shed some light on what the bomber's motivations were. James Russell was just about as crazy as the bomber was. Like Sherlock Holmes, he was a drug addict. He was extremely eccentric. He obsessively wrote crossword puzzles with grids that he obsessively drew himself.
Dr. Brussel had worked primarily in public hospital settings. Some of his work focused specifically on people who were both criminals and mentally ill, so that gave him contact with people who'd committed crimes in a way that not all psychiatrists had. In the 1940s, the homicide detectives had little use for psychiatry. They thought they knew what mattered about criminal behavior. They didn't think psychiatrists had much to offer.
Coincidentally, Dr. Brussel had followed the Mad Bomber case from the beginning and had a plan to create a radical new method that would help to catch him.
Howard Finney came to Dr. Brussel's office with satchels of evidence. Dr. Brussel examined this evidence. After about 2 hours, he turned to Detective Finney and he said, "The man that you're looking for lives in a northern suburb of the city. He's never had a girlfriend. He has a history of workplace disputes. He comes from a Slavic background. He's somewhat impoverished. And the last thing he said was, when you catch him, he'll be wearing a double-breasted suit. And it will definitely be buttoned."
The reason he got that profile correct had to do with his being presented evidence that contained usable clues, his psychiatric insight into what some of those clues might mean. His inference that the killer would be of Slavic origin was based on his knowledge that bombing was favored in Middle Europe, the use of stabbing was frequent in Middle Europe. The use of both together implied this person would have been influenced by their ancestors.
When Dr. Brussel analyzed FP's letters, he recognized persistent and logically constructed delusions. He saw that FP believed forces were controlling him and plotting against him. These characteristics were consistent with paranoid schizophrenia.
He was correct that the bomber would be neat and properly dressed, and that he inferred from the meticulousness of the bomb construction. People who are paranoid and see themselves as flawless want others to see them that way, so they follow the rules, they do precisely what's expected, and they think others should do so too.
Dr. Brussel told Captain Finney to publish the criminal profile in the newspaper. If FP was the self-righteous paranoid that Brussel believed him to be, he wouldn't be able to resist an opportunity to set the record straight.
A letter was published in the New York Journal American, and lo and behold, the bomber wrote back. And with each letter, the newspaper would learn a little bit more about the bomber, information that they, of course, would share with the police. By triangulating this information, they were able to look for a file in the Con Ed records of disgruntled former employees. They eventually closed in on the file of an employee living in Waterbury, Connecticut. The police knocked on the door at midnight. A middle-aged man came to the door. He fit Dr. Brussel's description pretty much exactly. When the detective said, "Go get dressed," You're coming downtown with us. Sure enough, he came out of his bedroom with a double-breasted jacket, and it was buttoned. He turned out to be a man from a Lithuanian background named George Metesky. He was, in fact, the bomber.
His motive was revenge against the Consolidated Edison Company for a 1931 plant accident he believed gave him tuberculosis. Now he faces sanity tests and trial. His campaign ended.
The bomber believed that he was on a moral crusade to right a wrong that had been done to him by the powerful forces in America that he believed were conspiring against him. He believed that he was a kind of God and that he was guiding the world in the right way. Well, if you're going to guide the world in the right way, you better be dressed right for that. We have all grown up with this idea of thinking that you are either insane or you're sane. What profilers would tell you is that it's not really like that. We're all a little bit insane, and we are all on a spectrum of insanity.
Those who began doing what became known as profiling, in their effort to find anyone who'd done this before, stumbled on Russell's book. He anticipated the field. The pioneers who started to form a systematic approach to profiling, John Douglas, Bob Ressler, every time they were out somewhere training, they'd stick around an extra day to interview some criminals that the warden would let them in to see.
These profilers conducted interviews with some of the most notorious violent criminals in American history, including Ted Bundy, John Wayne Gacy, James Earl Ray, David Berkowitz, and Charles Manson.
For many offenders who've already been convicted, they're happy to talk about this. And of course, when those very agents told Tom Harris, he wrote Silence of the Lambs, inventing Clarice Starling, the young agent who would go out and interview an offender. I think eventually there will be major technological advances, but I think it's always going to be important that people who know about psychopathology, about human nature and human behavior be at the helm of this.
Can science grasp the mind of a serial killer? Or does it take something more than that? Dr. Russell's genius was that he could see that it did require science, but it required something else. It required intuition, something mysterious.
Okay, so hopefully you found that as interesting as I did. It's pretty much the birth of criminal profiling as we know it here. And if you haven't noticed, pause the video to put in some headphones here so I can hopefully get some decent audio on this video. So when we take a look at what exactly is the purpose of profiling, well, it's to generate a composite of inferences about an unknown offender that will assist in a more rapid apprehension and prosecution. So some of the goals of profiling is to generate hypotheses that can help narrow down leads. Whenever there is a crime, particularly a sensational crime, say like a serial killer type of phenomenon, or a serial bomber, or some type of big event, police departments are often inundated with leads that kind of go nowhere. I mean, you might get thousands and thousands of leads that have absolutely nothing to really do with the crime in general. So having some type of profile might help you to weave through those different leads and kind of narrow down the ones that are worth pursuing and those that are not worth pursuing. Another goal of profiling is to make suggestions for how to maximize the effectiveness of suspect interviews. So what do we mean by that? Well, the way that, and this is something that we're going to explore in great detail next week, we'll start getting into confessions and the way that confession, the different techniques that are used to elicit confessions. But if you have a psychological profile of the type of person that you think is capable, or is the type of person who actually committed this crime, it might help investigators determine what types of questions to ask them. For example, if you come up with a profile that says this person is likely narcissistic, while interviewing somebody who you think might be your suspect, and the profile says they're likely to be narcissistic, this might actually kind of guide you in the types of questions you want to ask. Somebody who's narcissistic and a criminal might be willing to talk and give away kind of their secrets, and in an attempt to try to impress the investigators. So you might want to kind of play up the brilliance of this crime, right? How it's eluded the police for so long that the person we're looking for must be a genius, right? This is playing into that person's narcissism, and it might actually get them to talk and start revealing details that you could determine whether this is your suspect, or whether this person is worthy of remaining a potential suspect. Another goal is to assess physical evidence found in possession of the suspect. So if you have a criminal profile that says, well, this person, is making these bombs or so, is likely to be ex-military, and you apprehend a suspect, and it turns out, they have a military ID card on them. Well, this person fits the profile, so it might make them more of a suspect, or it might make them, or might make you more confident that they're worthy of pursuing or keeping as a suspect. If you were to get a search warrant for their home and you found a whole bunch of different devices and different tools, and the profile says, well, this person is likely very proficient in hands-on type of experience, so somebody like an electrician or a carpenter or so, and you find those types of tools, that it's not evidence that the person is guilty, but it certainly fits the profile of the type of person you're looking for. So if you already have a search warrant, you would most definitely have probable cause to search this person's property to begin with. So you'd kind of be looking for certain things during that search, or keeping an eye open for certain things that would fit the profile of the person you were looking for. So what actually goes into a profile report? What actually goes into a psychological profile? Well, most profiles typically read like normal psychological evaluation type of reports. And we'll talk about psychological evaluation reports as they relate to the legal system once we start getting into the insanity defense, and once we start getting into competency to stand trial. But psychological evaluation reports are very common in the legal system, and a standard report would include things like demographic information. So information regarding the likely suspect's age and their sex and their race and their occupational skills, marital status, socioeconomic status. The report will also have a section on what kind of intelligence that the person has, so their level of intelligence and what kind of education they were likely to have received, including specialized training or skills. So not just college education, but also like trade school types of education. The profile report We'll also include a section on potential criminal history. So based on evaluating a crime scene, you're able to tell, whether this is the first time a person has been involved in such criminal activity, or if they have some type of level of criminal expertise, so to speak. So you might also be able to determine whether this is the first time they've actually killed somebody, right? If we're doing a profile on a murderer or a serial killer, or if they were more likely to have been involved in some lesser or more petty type of crimes in the past. The profile report will also include potential information about whether or not this person has any type of military background. There are certain types of skills, including discipline, that you might be able to surmise from a crime scene, and a suspect or the person's behavior in terms of how they interact with the police after they commit a crime, or how they interact with the media after they commit a crime. Some killers, some criminals are just much more disciplined than others. And of course, if they're using particular techniques that they would only learn in the military, when you're in the military, you learn how to tie, just as an example, you learn to tie various types of knots in rope. And if you find, that this person is using a particular knot to tie up their victims before they kill them, you might say, well, this is what the Marine, this is usually taught, in the Marines or in the Army. So you might be able to surmise that they have some type of military background or some type of military training. And that could also, be surmised by what type of weapon that they're using to commit their crime, and how they dispose of a body, or dispose of evidence, or how they try to stage a crime scene. All of those things can kind of give. All of this is about inference, right? You're just making inferences. Is that this person is likely to have some type of military training, or even some type of law enforcement training sometimes as well, right? So what else do we get in this report? Well, it often includes a section about family characteristics. So whether the person we're looking for, whether they live alone, whether they're married, if they have children, whether their parents are still alive. There are lots of different things that you can, again, infer about their family makeup. For example, if they are active only at night, it might suggest that they have a family, and it might actually suggest that they also have a full-time job. So they're not killing anybody during the day because they have a full-time job, and then they have to maybe go pick up the kids and then go have dinner with the family, and maybe they're waiting until their spouse goes to sleep before they go out and rape and murder, right? So maybe even the time of day can give you a clue as to the makeup of their family. Also, the way that bodies are staged, especially if children victims are involved, the way that criminals will treat their child victims can give you an idea whether they have children of their own. So another area of the psychological report might include habits and social interests. And again, this can be surmised by different aspects of the crime scene. and also the different types of tools that they might use to commit their crime. So, for example, as we saw with the Mad Bomber, he used a pocket knife to create, a hole, a cut in a seat, a theater seat, in order to put a bomb in there. But just the idea that somebody might carry around a pocket knife. You know, certain people carry around pocket knives, usually people who have certain types of hobbies that would require the use of a pocket knife, right? Or where they might be targeting their victims. If it's at a strip club, let's say, versus a museum, you might be able to gain some insight in terms of what this person's social interests might be, or what their hobbies, let's say, might be. Number 7, resonance in relation to the crime scene. Most of the time, the suspect you're looking for is likely to live in the neighborhood in which they're committing the crime. Now, that's not always the case, and there are certain aspects of the crime scene that the crime and the crime scene and the type of victims that they're choosing that might tell you what's the likelihood that they live in the area or not. For example, if it looks like the person walked to the crime scene, you find the same type of foot or shoe imprint at each of these crime scenes, and you never seem to find any unusual tire tracks or tire impressions. Well, then this is a pretty good indication that they live within walking distance, that they live pretty close. Also, where the crime takes place, and let's say if a serial killer commits a murder somewhere and then they dispose of the body somewhere else, even the distance, how far away from the actual murder scene to where the body was dumped, might give you an indication of where this person lives. Also, where exactly the body was dumped. Was it dumped in a place that somebody who really who is likely only would be familiar with an area like that if they lived in the neighborhood? So if the body was dumped underneath a bridge somewhere, and it was left out in the open to suggest that this person was pretty confident that they weren't going to get caught, well, that kind of suggests that they've been to this place before, maybe multiple times, and they know that it's not frequented very often. So that suggests that they live in the area, that they're familiar with this area. You can also determine one part of the report also, based on various aspects of the crime scene and how the crime was committed, the color, age, and type of vehicle that they are driving. So that's starting to get into areas that are beyond my expertise in there. But you can imagine that somebody who, let's say, we assume is narcissistic or is materialistic, would be driving a newer car, and most likely not a Hyundai Accent like I drive, right? Not a 2010 Hyundai Accent. Then somebody like that would be actually using their car as some type of social symbol, or a symbol of social status, or something along those lines. When it comes to the color of an automobile, we're starting to get a little bit into personality psychology, which I'm not a huge fan of, even though I'm teaching it this semester. It's just a lot of that stuff is not it's not testable. We don't really have any scientific evidence to back some of this stuff up. And believe it or not, I'm getting a little bit ahead of myself, but that's one of the major criticisms about profiling in general, is that there might not be a whole lot of research about all the stuff I'm talking about even right now, right? But continuing along with what might also exist in this type of profile would be personality characteristics and possible mental illnesses, particularly when it comes to those axis 2 the axis 2 disorders, right? The personality disorders. So you might say, well, this person doesn't have obsessive compulsive disorder, but they might have some obsessive compulsive personality disorder, that there's some aspects of the crime, say, the way that they clean up the body, or clean up the crime scene, or how they stage it, might suggest to you that they have certain types of personality issues going on there, other than, obviously antisocial personality disorder. If they're killing people, we're pretty certain they got that one, right? But some other types of personality characteristics and other types of potential mental illnesses, including depression and even anxiety, or even panic disorder, right? Sometimes we can determine from a crime scene that they panicked, either before, during, or after the crime. And number 10, suggested interview techniques. So again, going back to this earlier idea that once you have a profile on a person, you kind of have a better idea of how to approach them. If we know that the person who likely committed this crime is likely to possess X, Y, and Z type of characteristics, and respond to, praise, or respond to criticism in very extreme type of ways, we might want to be able to use that to our advantage to try to elicit these types of emotions. Typically, when people become emotional, they're not thinking rationally, so it's harder to maintain the lie. It's also harder to maintain innocence, right? When you know you're guilty, if you're able to stir somebody up and get them emotional, they're likely to start making mistakes in there, right? Okay, so when it comes to the stages of profiling, what's actually involved in creating a psychological or behavioral profile, the first is input. So you need to collect crime scene information, and this is done by a crime scene investigative team or detective team. The next stage all this information is going to be given to the profiler, or somebody who has experience in profiling. Their title might not be profiler, right? But somebody who engages in these types of creating these types of criminal or behavioral profiles. You would need to give them as much information as possible, access to the entire case file in there. The next stage would be the decision process. So the person who's creating this profile is going to start arranging all of this information that they were given into meaningful patterns and start analyzing what we call victim and offender risk. And we'll take a look at each of these here. And when we talk about victim risk in particular, we have to be careful that we're to realize that we're not victim blaming here. But when we talk about victim risk, it's the amount of risk, and it's usually denoted as high, medium, or low, that the victim placed themselves in. And again, that sounds like victim blaming, but of course, this is just for purposes of creating a profile. So different types of offenders are going to target different types of victims. So knowing the level of risk that a victim engaged in can help you learn something about the offender. So a lot of serial killers will target, let's say, prostitutes, female prostitutes, or transgender prostitutes. Why? Well, because that's a high risk. That's a high risk job, and it's likely that, it's horrible to say, but it's likely that people are going to expect something to happen to these types of victims. They're putting they're in a very dangerous occupation, where people are expecting violence to be kind of par for the course, part of the job, and also that people who are doing this type of work might also not have a whole lot of friends or family who would be able to notice that they're missing, or bother to even report that they're missing, right? So if somebody is targeting, say, very vulnerable populations, or drug dealers, or, well, targeting drug dealers could be pretty high risk for the offender in that regard. It's both, high risk for the victim, the person who's selling drugs, but also if you kill a drug dealer, you have to deal with that drug dealer is working for somebody who's probably going to want retaliation in there. So depending on the victim's level of risk, we could determine whether or not the offender is choosing quote-unquote easy targets, or if they're choosing say more difficult targets. You can imagine that we could learn something about an offender based on the types of victims that they're choosing. If they're choosing, say, sex workers, street workers, say prostitutes, or are they targeting politicians? Those are very different types of victims in there. So there's some information that we can learn about that. When it comes to offender risk, this is the amount of risk, again, high, medium, or low, that the offender is going to place themselves in that might lead to their apprehension. So an example of this might be, say, a high-risk offender. It would be shooting somebody in the middle of Times Square in broad daylight. That is pretty gutsy for somebody to do. That's going to tell us something about this offender, versus somebody who is waiting until 2-3 in the morning and targeting people whose cars are broken down on the side of the road or something, where that would be more low risk in terms of getting caught. So based on offender risk and victim risk, we're able to infer some things about the type of person, the type of suspect that we're looking for. And your readings go into much more detail about some of those things. So I'm not going to talk about them because I want you to do the readings. I don't want to give all the juicy stuff away here. Right? So part of that decision process in terms of arranging all of this information into meaningful patterns is going to be evaluating what kind of risk that the victim had put themselves in, or that they were in, and how much risk that the offender was willing to take. And those could give us some ideas of who we are dealing with, or who we're looking for. The third stage would be the crime assessment. So reconstructing the crime and the offender motivation. So a big part of this can be taking a look at how, or the methods. Again, if we're just going back to, let's just use a murder as an example here. But if we see that somebody shot some person 5 times in the head and then stabbed them, in the chest 20 times, that's something that we would call overkill. You didn't need to assault that person that much in order to kill them. Probably 1 bullet to the head would have been good enough, 2 if you just wanted to be sure, but these are 5 bullets and a bunch of stabbings. And even when we take a look at something like shooting versus stabbing, shooting, you could shoot someone from, with a rifle from a mile away if you're really good and you have a high-powered rifle, sniper rifle, right? But stabbing is really intimate. You have to get up and really close to somebody. You're going to be getting their blood all over you and that. So when we take a look at stabbings, particularly multiple stabbings in, say, like the chest area, or say the heart or something, we might assume that this was some type of crime of passion. They really wanted this person dead, right? It wasn't just a matter of a robbery gone wrong or a drug deal gone wrong or even a murder for hire type of thing. It's likely whoever killed this person, they knew this person. And, if I had to put money on it from what I know about profiling is that there was some type of sexual motivation involved. Either this was a jaded lover, or this was their victim was somebody who might have rejected them, or was somebody they had been stalking for sexual or romantic purposes, right? Just because of the intimacy that's involved and because of the overkill. There's a lot of rage, there's a lot of anger that was being taken out on that victim. So trying to reconstruct the crime and how it happened, how they even entered the premise, how they got access to the victim, all of those things can help us determine the suspect's motivation, who we might be looking for. Number 4, the criminal profile, in terms of actually developing specific descriptions of the offender. So this is kind of the last stage here. Well, not the last stage, but this is when we're actually coming up with the profiling report. We first have to collect all the information. We have to start arranging this information into meaningful type of patterns, then try to reconstruct the crimes, and try to infer some type of characteristics about the person we're looking for based on that reconstruction of the crime. Stage 5 would be investigation. So the police department or the investigative body, might be the FBI, right? Whoever, is going to then use this profile to help aid in their investigation. And that could be helping to actually narrow in on a suspect, or narrow down suspects, right? So when I say narrow in, I mean actually going out and looking for particular people in the neighborhood who kind of fit this profile, fit this description. Or you might have a whole list of a bunch of possible suspects, and then you can use this profile to help aid in getting rid of people as potential suspects because they just don't fit this profile. So as a way of kind of narrowing down the people who you should be focusing on. And then finally, apprehension. This is kind of where we get to check whether or not, once we got the perpetrator, the offender, we're able to determine whether or not that this profile was actually accurate. So we get to test that profile against this new information that emerges once we actually apprehend the offender. So when we talk about criminal profiling, we'll see that it's often criticized for being more of an art form than it is a science, and I would certainly agree with that as well. But some profiles or some profiles and profilers are much better, more accurate than others, clearly. But when we try to test the usefulness and accuracy of these profiles in the laboratory, some of the results are just not all that impressive or replicable here. But regardless, the profiler should have access to all information about the case, but we don't want to give the profiler access to the list of any suspects, because why? Well, we want to avoid confirmation bias. We definitely don't want to let the profiler know, hey, we think it's this person. Can you come up with a profile? Well, chances are the profile is probably going to match that guy who you just said you think did it, right? So we want to make sure the profiler doesn't have access to the list of suspects to try to avoid that type of confirmation bias in there. Okay, so some of the factors that are used in profiling, things that profilers will kind of look for. The first is escalation. So most people who commit crimes will typically start with less serious crimes, and those crimes will escalate over time. So even when we see patterns among serial killers, they will typically start by killing and torturing animals before, say, moving on to humans. And a person who might be new to killing might target a high risk a very low risk victim. So say a prostitute on the street, or a known drug abuser, somebody who is not likely to have a whole lot of people looking for them, let's say, but they might escalate, and their crimes might become more vicious and more cruel and severe over time. So when we talk about profiling, one of the things we're going to be looking for is whether or not there's an escalation going on. Staging of the crime scene and the body is also important. So when we talk about staging, this is the alteration of crime scene in order to kind of redirect the investigation away from the offender. So are they trying to stage the crime scene in a way to kind of throw off the detectives, to try to point the investigation away from them? Or maybe they will actually stage the crime scene in such a way to make a political type of statement, or to make some type of statement, whether it's political or not. It might be a statement about how they felt towards the victim of their crime. So sometimes we will see uh, minimal staging of a crime scene. Somebody who might just overthrow or overturn a table or something like that, just to say, hey, maybe they'll think it was a robbery gone wrong. And sometimes we'll see staging that is very elaborate, almost methodical, in such a way that um, could be done to try to deceive investigators, or it might be done to fulfill some type of fantasy or some type of ritual that the offender is looking to fulfill. Um, we said before that the notion of timing. So when are these crimes being committed? That could actually tell us a whole lot of information about the offender. So when the offender committed the crime, and how much time did they spend with the victim? How much time did they have access to the victim? That could give us an indication about their employment and employment status, how close they live in proximity to the victim, and also give us some information about their living arrangements and potential relationships, and even the possibility that they have children or not, and also their relationship to the victim as well. So it's important to know when the crimes are being uh, conducted, when they're taking place, and how much time is actually being used, in the commission of the crime, and sometimes the disposal of the body, right? Um, Location. So another factor that we want to consider when profiling is where the offender apprehended the victim. So was it in the victim's home? Did they apprehend the victim on the street? So where the victim was apprehended is not always where the victim was actually killed. So maybe they were apprehended in one place and taken to another place to be killed, and then actually taken to a third place in order to be disposed of. So the location of where these three things are happening can give us an indication of the offender's thinking, but also give us an indication of the offender's proximity in terms of, do they live in this area? Do they live in this neighborhood? Are they familiar with these? I mean, three different spots, knowing that you can apprehend somebody in one place and not get caught, kill them in another place and not get caught, and dispose of them in yet another place and not get caught. And all three of these locations were pretty close together. That's going to tell me, and most likely most profilers, that the person lives in the area and they're actually pretty familiar with the area. That they might actually be a jogger or a hiker, or maybe their job is some type of public service job. Maybe they're a police officer, maybe they're a maintenance person, maybe they're a postal worker. Who knows? But it seems like they would know this area pretty well. Another factor that we would look into or consider during profiling is modus operandi. So this is the method of carrying out the crime. So this method of how they actually carry out the crime can change as the offender gains experience. So as let's say in our case, serial killer becomes more skillful, they might start changing how they're killing, and what methods they're using to apprehend, to to kill and also to dispose of the crime, or dispose of the body. So their crimes might become more sophisticated over time, so to speak. So when we talk about ritualistic types of behaviors, they can actually be very useful in profiling, particularly in cases of sexual violence. So if they're sexually assaulting their victims before killing them, and if it's done in a ritualistic way, this might tell us something about again the person's profession, also their relationship status, might give us clues about whether or not they have previous a previous criminal background, particularly when it comes to sexual assault. So ritualistic behavior is very helpful in trying to determine what kind of person that we're looking for here. So when it comes to organization, this is also a big part of profiling. So when we talk about organization, we're basically talking about neat versus sloppy types of crime scenes. So organized crime scenes will reflect a high level of control, where restraints might have been used on the victim, so they were tied up somehow, or otherwise restrained, and the body was disposed of in some thoughtful type of manner. There was some some attempt rather to clean up, so to speak, the crime scene. So organized offenders are usually socially competent, so they usually have pretty good social skills. They tend to be intelligent. Most likely they're living with a partner, a romantic partner, but could also be a roommate, but they're not living alone. They're also more likely to follow their crime in the media. They're interested in knowing what the police know, and they might actually get some kind of thrill out of hearing details about the crime, particularly if the news is talking about the brutalness of the offense. That they're there to they're following the media in following their crime in the news, maybe to get a little bit of a rise from it, but also to know when it's time to get the hell out of town, right? When the heat might be on them too much. So for that reason, they're likely to change locations after they committed the crime. So these type of organized crime scenes, the people who are involved are more likely to have, they're more likely to be sociopathic, more likely to be manipulative, or to have narcissistic personalities, or have narcissistic personality disorders. So if they're going out of their way to create a organized crime scene and to dispose of evidence and dispose of the body, they're also more likely to be neat. They're more likely to maybe even have a little bit of an OCD. But we'd be looking for ritualistic or for some type of patterns in there. But these people tend to be just neat, charming, attractive. Your typical psychopath. Your typical, serial killer who is charming and able to commit the crimes that he does because of his manipulative type of social skills. So that's in contrast to a disorganized crime scene. So a disorganized crime scene is going to reflect a lack of control. So it's going to reflect impulsiveness and a a lack of planning. Also, these crime scenes typically have what are known or what are called a weapon of opportunity. So basically just picking up whatever's around, right? If somebody was beaten to death with, say, a poker stick, not a poker stick, a pool stick or something, that might be very different than somebody who actually brings their own weapon to the crime scene. This type of disorganized crime scene, where a weapon of opportunity is used, we see that there's often no attempt to dispose of the body at all. It's usually just left in plain sight. In these types of cases, almost always the victim was known to the offender. So this was there was some type of purpose to this crime. The offender is not necessarily psychopathic. They very well might have personality disorders. I mean, most of us don't go around killing people we don't like, but it's possible that they had some type of personal reason for it. Doesn't mean it's a good reason, but because they were more likely to have known the victim, there's more likely to have been some motive connected to that person specifically, right? So they weren't chosen at random, let's say. So in these types of unorganized or disorganized crime scenes, the offender is likely to have a poor work history. They're more likely to live alone and in close proximity to the crime scene. They're also more likely to have little interest in following media coverage of the crime, so they're really not keen on keeping up with what the police are doing or what the media are saying. They don't change, so they're not likely to change their lifestyle after the crime, and they're more likely to have an unkept appearance and be unattractive, and less charming, and have less less sophisticated, or less, what's the word I'm looking for, they're not likely to have the greatest of social skills, let's say here. One thing that we also notice with disorganized crime scenes are that the offenders tend to have little experience with members of the opposite sex, and a lot of times the crime is actually motivated by frustration, or because of sexual frustration, or because of some type of obsession or stalking type of behaviors, or because their victim actually rejected them sexually or romantically. Okay, so when it comes to some of the issues that we have with profiling, you'll read about these in your articles, and I really hope you spent some time. These are pretty cool articles that go into this issue of profiling much more than what I'm talking about now. So if you're interested in this area, I hope that you do the readings and maybe even write your reaction paper on this topic. But some of the major issues we have is that most profiling is based on clinical experience, not research. So it's not, profiling is not rooted in empirical evidence. Also, another major concern or limitation is that there's often a lack of coordination between units of a criminal investigation. So the crime lab might not be talking to the detectives, and the detectives might not be talking to the other detectives, who might not be talking to the profiler. So this type of lack of coordination often, more often than you would expect, leads to incomplete inputs. So the profiler's not getting all of the information they need, right? So it might lead to an incomplete profile or a whole bunch of time delays. So it could be a very long process. We also have issues with profiling testimony being used in court because it's not scientifically based. So we've run into some issues there, particularly on cross-examination. You can imagine a profiler being kind of torn apart by a defense attorney when they have to admit that their entire profile is not rooted in science at all, right? And also, just the fact of the matter that not all crimes are actually suitable for profiling. Typically speaking, you would in order to create an accurate profile or a more accurate profile, you would need multiple instances of the same perpetrator committing a crime. But I believe I have a video here that will talk a little bit more about problems with profiling, and actually a study that took a look at whether or not profilers are even all that better than, say, you or I, right? So let's see what they have to say in here.
At face value, the FBI's approach sounds highly intuitive and appealing. However, one major issue with it is it's unclear, aside from the original study conducted by interview with serial sexual murderers, how these associations between crime scene characteristics and offender characteristics have actually come about. Traditionally, the FBI in their accounts have placed great emphasis on their investigators' field experience, and they cite this as the key factor that underpins the associations that they assert. So a key question is, how well do these profiles actually perform? Although there have been many anecdotal examples and unpublished reports claiming the success of the FBI's method of profiling, there are in fact very few published empirical analyses, and each of these are controversial in their own way. However, as an illustrative study, we will go back to one of the first. And these were conducted by Anthony Pinizzotto with the collaboration of the FBI. In a paper published in 1990, Anthony Pinizzotto and Norman Finkel sought to determine whether professional profilers were more accurate than non-profilers in generating personality profiles and correctly identifying offender features from crime scene details. They also wanted to explore whether the processes used by the profilers were qualitatively different from the processes used by non-profilers. Now, in total, they had 28 participants who were categorized on the basis of their profiling expertise. And we're going to concentrate on just 24 of those participants. These were 6 police detectives who made up the profilers group. That is, they'd all been specifically trained in profiling. They'd completed a 1-year program through the FBI Behavioral Science Unit and had a range of 1 to 6 years experience in actually profiling. The second group was a group of detectives. This group was made up of 6 detectives from a large metropolitan city police department. Now, these officers had no training in profiling, but they were experienced police investigators in homicide and sex offence cases, which were the 2 crimes chosen for this study. The third group were a group of clinical psychologists, and the fourth group was a group made up of students. In each of these were 6 participants who met the criteria, and they were selected as non-police participants who were both naive to profiling and criminal investigations. All participants were given materials from 2 closed cases. That is, these crimes had actually already been solved. One case involved a homicide and the other a sex offence. In both cases, participants were provided with information about the victim and also the crime scene reports. So for the sexual offence, they detailed the events leading up to the offence, what actually occurred in the offence itself, and the events that followed the offence. In addition, in this case, participants also read a detailed victim statement, what happened and what the offender did and said. Now, in the homicide case, participants were given 14 black and white crime scene photos. They were also given autopsy and toxicology reports. Now, these detailed the cause, the manner, and the mode of death. And the toxicology report showed whether there were any chemical agents present in the victim's system at the time of death that may have caused or contributed to the death. Now, in both cases, in order to protect the identity of the victim, some information that would normally be made available to profilers, such as maps of the geographical area where the crimes took place, were actually absent. So all participants read both cases and they balanced the order. So some read the homicide case first and the others read the sexual offence case first. Now, after they read each case, they were asked to cover the material and write down as many details about the case that they were able to remember. They then had to use this to note down all the details from the crime scene that they felt were necessary and important to be used in writing a profile about the type of person who would commit such a crime. And also note down why they felt these facts were important. They were also then asked to write a profile of the type of person who committed the crime and to give as much detail as possible. And then they had to record this onto audio tape. Finally, they were given a multiple choice question sheet. This consisted of 20 questions about the suspect, questions about their age, their gender, their residence, their employment. Now, 15 of these could be scored as being correct or not. And as a very last step, they completed a line-up task. Participants were given 5 descriptions of possible suspects, and they had to rank order them from 1, the suspect they thought who was most likely to have committed the crime, down to 5, the person least likely to have committed the crime. So what did they find on these measures? Well, the analysis indicated that profilers provided richer and longer reports than the non-profilers in terms of the number of predictions, for example. Critically, however, they also provided significantly more accurate predictions in both cases. Profilers were significantly more accurate than the non-profiler groups. However, when their responses to the multiple choice questions were analysed, profilers only scored significantly better than the other 3 groups combined for the sexual offence case. Similarly, when looking at the lineup results, the superior ability of the profilers to identify the correct offender only emerged in relation to the sexual offence. It didn't emerge on either measure in the homicide case. Finally, when looking at how profilers used the information they were given, to see if the way they used it differed from how other participants used their information, they found no evidence that the profilers assessed the information in a qualitatively different way from the non-profilers. So this study gives us a mixed picture of how profilers actually perform. Professional profilers provided richer profiles. They made more accurate predictions in their written profiles than participants belonging to the other groups. Further, professional profilers were more accurate in terms of multiple choice responding and in picking out the perpetrator for a lineup for the sex offence case than non-profilers. But those accuracy differences were not seen in the homicide case. Here, profilers performed just as well, or rather just as poorly, as detectives, psychologists and students. So why? Was the version of the homicide case just too sanitised? Or the profilers noted that information they'd expected to see when constructing a profile was actually missing in this study? Or was it more to do with the fact that the homicide offender did not fit the base rates in all ways? And this shows an inherent problem in profiling. What if your offender isn't a statistically normal or a typical offender?
Okay, so hopefully you found that pretty interesting, right? Because that is one of only a few studies that actually evaluate the accuracy of professional profiles compared to basically the rest of us, quite literally the rest of us, right? Psychologists, students, and detectives in there. And profilers we saw they provided richer and more accurate profiles for the sexual offense case, but not for the homicide case. And I would say if you scroll back a little bit after I wrap this up, just go take a look at those effects. The profiles did better, but not that much better. Not that much better than the rest of us, right? It was statistically significant, but I'm not that impressed in terms of the effect size. But maybe you are. That's okay. So when it comes to profiling, again, it can be useful. Professional profilers might not be that much better than the rest of us. At the same token, they know what to look for. And after this week's lecture and this week's readings, in particular, you'll know what to look for too. So you might be just as good as a professional profiler, at least when it comes to homicide cases, right? So there's something there. If you get nothing out of this class, there's that at least. So our next lecture is going to deal with serial homicide and mass murder, and I'm going to render this video, clear some hard drive space, and I'll see you in a bit to get going on the next lecture. Okay, see you soon.